Ultreia, onward. This medieval call urged pilgrims to continue their journey, inspired them in their struggles, and gave them hope in reaching their goal, be it Jerusalem, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela. Today, one more often hears the greeting, Buen Camino, good road, good journey. It seems that the journey has supplanted the destination on the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. In 2012, at this pilgrimage symposium, I proposed that pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela were a self-identifying group. In talking about the authenticity of persons who walked or biked or rode to Compostela, I suggested that if they said they were pilgrims and they felt they were pilgrims, then they should be considered pilgrims, irrespective of their motives or the distance they traveled or their mode of transportation. Nearly 10 years later, I still believe that 21st century pilgrims are self-identifying, but I question whether they are on the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela or whether they are pilgrims to an experience, the Camino itself. Just as the signi peregrinationis of the medieval pilgrim, the staff and satchel, have changed to the ubiquitous scallop shell and yellow arrow, so has the designated destination of the pilgrimage to Santiago changed from the tomb of St. James in the Cathedral of Santiago in the northwest corner of Spain to where? There is a slow but discernible change in pilgrims' tales over time, a change that has accelerated in the past 20 years. By looking at changes in English pilgrim narratives, we can see a change in the destination from Santiago de Compostela to the experience of the journey itself. It may be that the journey, whether on the Camino Frances, the Primitivo, the Portuguese Way, the Via de la Plata, or any of the other developing, discovered, or rediscovered routes is, in and of itself, the pilgrimage destination. Perhaps the Camino in the 21st century is returning full circle to its earliest realization as a sacred journey, following a heavenly band of light to the sea at Finisterre and the spiritual symbolism of the Pectus Maximus found off its coast, a link between sea and land. Let's back up and survey the narrative of the pilgrimage to Santiago, the Camino, if you will, across the centuries. While some ascribe to a belief in an ancient spiritual Camino along the ley lines of northern Spain, the historical beginning of the Christian pilgrimage to Santiago began with the angelic announcement of St. James' tomb to the hermit Pelagius in the mid-9th century. This was followed by a sighting of heavenly lights seen by the faithful in San Fis parish, who then presented these miraculous visions to Bishop Teodomiro of Iria, who then pronounced this to truly be the tomb of St. James, and informed King Alfonso the Chaste, who immediately began the construction of a church. In 951, the first known pilgrim from beyond Hispania, Bishop Goldescalc from Le Puy, France, arrived in Santiago. By the mid-12th century, much of the documentation of the pilgrimage to Compostela that we rely on today had been collected in the Liber Sancti Jacobis, commonly known by the name of its most famous manuscript, the Codex Calixtinus. Its 5 books, the Sermons and Liturgy, the Miracles, the Translatio Story, the Pseudo-Turpin, and especially the Pilgrim Guide, set up the modern understanding of what was the medieval pilgrimage to Compostela. The translations of the Pilgrim's Guide, to Spanish in 1927, to French in 1938, to German in 1986, Italian in 1989, and English in 1992, have led modern pilgrims to believe in the primacy of the Camino Frances. It is not the Pilgrim's Guide, however, that associates the Camino with the Milky Way, but rather Book 4, the Pseudo-Turpin Chronicle. Its opening chapter finds Charlemagne contemplating the Caminus Stellarum, the road of stars, leading from the Frisian Sea through Germany, Italy, Gaul, Aquitaine, and Navarre to Galicia. One evening, St. James appears to him in a vision and urges him to free the route and his tomb from the infidels. In the chronicle, Charlemagne reaches the sea, but at Padron, where Santiago's body had first been translated, and not to Finisterre. The medieval journey to Compostela was arduous, but the arrival to the tomb of St. James was paramount. From the stories within the Codex Calixtinus, we learn that the cathedral was open day and night to pilgrims. But when Count Pontius of Saint-Gilles and his retinue of 200 men wished to keep vigil through the night in the oratory, its gates were locked. The pilgrims met together, praying until, miraculously, the locks were found shattered, allowing them access to the tomb area. The heyday of pilgrimage to Compostela occurred in the 13th through the 15th centuries, evidenced by the great Romanesque pilgrimage churches built along the routes then in use. During the 16th century, largely due to the Reformation and the rise of Protestantism, which discredited the importance of relics, the veneration of saints, and the need for indulgences, Compostela's international fame and the number of pilgrims traveling there began to dwindle. Journeys to distant places became a luxury for the wealthy and well-educated, leading to the idea of the expensive grand tour of the great cities of Europe. Santiago de Compostela was not one of these cities. The wealthy no longer traveled to Compostela, although the poor continued to do so, taking advantage of the charity still bestowed on pilgrims at monasteries and churches. The number of poor required the enactment of vagrancy laws in Spain, exacting just where pilgrims could travel, how they could dress, and what papers and permissions they were required to carry. The Camino, it seems, was only a conduit for persons to travel to the shrine. Their motives for travel, along with it, were often questionable and their conduct worse. Nothing good happened on the road. By the 19th century, steam travel, both by rail and ship, opened a whole new world of travel possibilities. But again, Santiago de Compostela was left off most tourist routes due to its isolation. There was no direct rail line to Compostela from outside of Galicia until 1944. This was also a period of pilgrimage revival across Europe. Marian apparitions led to the tremendous growth of La Salette in Lourdes, France, Marpingen, Germany, Knock, Ireland, and Fatima, Portugal. Archaeological excavations brought curiosity seekers to Rome, and organized group trips conveyed thousands to Palestine. Despite the Santiago Cathedral excavations under the direction of Cardinal Payá-Rico, which led to the rediscovery of the remains of St. James in 1879, and followed by Pope Leo XIII's 1884 bull Deus Omnipotens confirming their authenticity, Compostela did not participate in this international phenomenon of revival. Compostela's remoteness, once an important attribute of its fame, existing as it did at the furthest reaches of Western Christendom, was, in the age of steam and travel and tourism, a detriment to its popularity. During that time, Richard Ford's Handbook for Travelers in Spain, 1845, gives insight into Santiago de Compostela as a pilgrim destination. His description disparages as unoriginal the legendary history of St. James, equating it with earlier mythology and pagan stories. The cathedral is central, however, to his town description, circling it as he does to describe each portal and each plaza before moving to the interior and doing the same with each chapel. By the 1882 edition, the disparaging marks were removed, and Compostela was listed as a stop on the ecclesiological tours. Ford separates tourists from pilgrims through his description of the process to gain the Compostela. He says, "The ceremonial by pilgrims to this shrine is after this way. The newly arrived ascends some steps behind the image, places his hands on the shoulders, and kisses the hood. This osculation is essential and is called the fin del romaje, the end, the object of the pilgrimage. The pilgrim next proceeds to one of the confessories and confesses. Then he is absolved, communicates, and receives his certificate, or as it is called, his Compostela. This is a printed Latin document signed by the canon, which certifies that he has complied with all the devotional ceremonies necessary to constitute a Romero, a real pilgrim." Clearly, there was more to getting to a Compostela than walking a minimum 100 kilometers. In the same 1882 edition, Ford also listed Compostela as a stop on the dilettante tours for sculpture, ushering in a new destination for a new type of pilgrim: the art, architecture, and sculpture historians and adventurers who arrived to experience the medieval town and view the Portico de la Gloria. The town, not necessarily the tomb, became the destination for these turigrinos. These visitors complain about the roads, the inns, the services, and the food. Certainly, they do not travel for the experiences along the Camino, but rather despite them. The journey is to be suffered for the delights of the end goal, and they describe Santiago much in the same way we talk about living history museums. The first inkling of walking as being an integral part of the pilgrimage to Santiago is noted by Catherine Hartley in her The Story of Santiago de Compostela in 1912. She is perhaps the first modern writer to champion the importance of slowing down to capture the spirit of pilgrimage, urging her readers to get off the train at Sesures, Padrón, or even Pontevedra and walk into Compostela along the old Pilgrim's Way. Georgiana Goddard King also recognized the Camino as central to the pilgrimage to Compostela. She brags of being a pilgrim walking into Santiago from all directions. She also argues that a pilgrim must be humble and poor, taking the third-class train to arrive at Compostela for the saint's day. Her work, The Way of St. James, 1920, combines narration of her travel experiences along the full Camino Frances, which serves as a transmission route of the Romanesque and Gothic art and architecture she studies. During the Franco years, 1936 to 75, St. James was highly promoted as the patron saint of Spain, especially in his role as warrior and protector. In 1948, youth in the Jons or Falange movements made the pilgrimage, stopping in towns along the Camino to provide food and support, a rather reverse show of pilgrims' charity. During the 1960s, the Camino was increasingly promoted by the Ministry of Information and Tourism as an economic, cultural, and historic resource. Previously abandoned or forgotten heritage structures were uncovered, and signage was erected to direct motorists to these spots. In fact, a driving credential was created, urging motorists to collect stamps at tourist offices in major towns along the Camino Frances. For the English-speaking world, two of the most influential pilgrim writers of this era are Walter Starkey and James Michener. Just as the medieval pilgrims did, Starkey clearly sees Compostela as the goal for his journey in The Road to Santiago in 1957. He ends his book by affirming the similarity of life to pilgrimage. He says, "Looking back, my various journeys along the Jacobean road become a huge, rambling peregrination through life, with many deviations into side roads and bypaths in quest of other shrines, but always with the firm intention of picking up again the trail to the tomb of the apostle." James Michener did not write a book solely about the pilgrimage to Compostela, but the last chapter of his personal travelogue, Iberia, 1968, introduced The Way of St. James to a general audience. In the brief but well-researched opening, he recounts facts, tradition, legends, and history of St. James and his pilgrims. He imagines the route from a perspective of the Middle Ages. Michener traveled by car, stopping in key cities and meeting with local scholars and priests. His detailed descriptions of Romanesque architecture and his inclusion of stories from the Codex Calixtinus give a sense of reading a history light of the Camino. After suffering a heart attack in 1965, Michener was unsure whether he would ever recover sufficiently to travel, but vowed to go to Compostela if he did. The following year, 1966, Michener, a Quaker, fulfilled his medieval vow, closing this chapter of both his life and his book by saying, quote, "I hid in the darkness as if an interloper with no proper role in the ceremonial, except that I had completed my vow of pilgrimage and stood at last with my arms about the stone-cold shoulder of Santiago, my patron saint and Spain's," unquote. These historical, cultural, devout retellings of two men's pilgrimages to Santiago are important touchstones for future pilgrims. Starkey being an influence on David Gitlitz, and Michener on me. Through the 1980s, the destination of pilgrims' narratives continued to be Santiago de Compostela and the rituals of the cathedral. Earlier, without infrastructure or yellow arrows, the journey was not for the faint of heart. Adventurous hikers, though, soon gave impetus to the reopening of traditional footpaths. The efforts to mark these routes, most notably by Father Elias Valiña of Febrero, allowed more casual pilgrims to undertake walking the way. Other factors contributed to a marked increase in the number of walking pilgrims in the 1980s, but it was the 1987 designation of the Camino Francés as the first European cultural itinerary by the Council of Europe that began promotion of the process of pilgrimage rather than its destination. The number of walking pilgrims along the route was still minuscule, but growing. 690 in 1985, 5,769 in 1989, compared to the average of only 183 per year in the 1970s. Pilgrimage accounts of the 80s and 90s still regarded the experience as an adventurous, physical recreation of a medieval ritual. The narratives tell of extraordinary events and sights experienced on the journey, recounted for the reader's enjoyment and edification. These authors were pioneers on the Camino Francés, often traveling for days without seeing another pilgrim. Their focus, therefore, is on the terrain, the weather, their meals and lodging, the sights and history of the towns through which they pass. Stories of camaraderie with other pilgrims are limited, and they offer only an occasional glimpse into their own emotions or motivations. These accounts focus on the external. The goal is the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, regardless whether the pilgrim is religious. The authors struggle to understand what it means to be a real pilgrim, for they have only the medieval model on which to base their identification. Thanks in part to the political support of the Galician government, Holy Year 1993 marks a watershed year in the pilgrimage to Santiago, with 99,436 pilgrims being granted the Compostela, a tenfold increase over the numbers of 1992. The availability of multiple guidebooks, easily booked accommodations, and a strong infrastructure encouraged more diversity among pilgrims walking the Camino. As pilgrims' experiences changed, so did the focus of their narratives. As more and more pilgrims arrived in Santiago de Compostela, fewer and fewer were familiar with the medieval heritage of the pilgrimage and its roots. In the 21st century, the numbers of pilgrims continues to increase dramatically. By reading earlier travel narratives, as well as information from multiple discussion boards and social media sites, many pilgrims now begin with expectations about what they will experience along the route. In writing their own pilgrim narratives, even though they still briefly describe key medieval stories and monuments, they are more likely to regale the reader with tales of new places and people that develop into modern Camino legends. The purpose of their pilgrimage becomes more personal in nature, and their writings provide insight about their motivation to follow the Camino: a personal loss, an illness, the need for space or time away from the mundane. A successful pilgrimage is often less about the physical goal, Santiago de Compostela, and more about the metaphysical one. Unlike medieval pilgrims who had an equally lengthy walk after their 3-day stay in Compostela, time during which they could process their experiences, modern pilgrims find themselves on a plane home, dumped back into their busy secular lives without a chance to sort out their experiences. Many, in hope of recapturing that feeling of calm or to prolong the journey, continue on to Finisterre or even Muxía, creating a new age spirituality and their own rituals, calques of the medieval, replete with their own compostelas, such as the Fisterrana, created in 1979. A new, transcendental, mystical attitude develops about the sanctity of the route itself, in which Santiago de Compostela is only a brief stopping point. The spirit of St. James is said to be on the Camino rather than enshrined in a church. Except for Edward Stanton's 1994 Road of Stars to Santiago, English pilgrimage tales don't continue to Finisterre until the 2000s, when suddenly it becomes de rigueur to complete the Camino. The concept of Finisterre being the end of the pilgrimage to Santiago is not supported by the Codex Calixtinus, although its marker, kilometers 0, is considered by many to be the end of the Camino. The connection to the sea, intimately related to the scallop shell of St. James, is the symbol most closely associated with the pilgrimage to Santiago, as well as with the Camino. Its rays representing the many roads leading to Santiago, or Finisterre. The American pilgrims on the Camino, founded in 2004, have renewed the medieval idea of a pilgrim blessing ceremony for first-time pilgrims before they begin their journeys. The shell ceremony, however, makes no mention of Compostela, nor of St. James, but does bestow a shell and blessing on those pilgrims for their journey and safe return. In the Codex Calixtinus, the scallop shell is a badge to be worn by pilgrims returning from the threshold of the saint, as proof of their journey and a symbol of a Christian's good works. Its ridges symbolizing the fingers of a hand, the two halves representing the great commandments of charity, to love God and to love one's neighbor as oneself. These shells, sold to pilgrims in Compostela, were believed to have potent powers. Miracle 12 tells how in 1106 a soldier in Apulia, Italy, is cured through the touch of a shell that has been brought back from Compostela. The expanding awareness of the Camino, thanks in part to the success of Emilio Estevez and Martin Sheen's 2010 film The Way, the ever-multiplying numbers of pilgrims, and the ease in self and on-demand publishing means that the numbers of Camino books is increasing exponentially. The commercialization of the now multiple caminos to Santiago is reflected in the commodification of pilgrim narratives. While the Camino has remained religious and/or spiritual in nature, for many it is no longer directly connected or affected by the historic pilgrimage to Santiago. Persons now elect to do the Camino and have their choice of paths as well as their choice of destinations. The Camino has become a place of communal, structural support, a repeatable retreat. Internet Camino forums, blogs, and Facebook groups now affirm there is no one right way to walk the Camino. With the rise of direct e-publishing, everyone can share their journey or discovery. No need to be a Spanish scholar, historian, or professional author. Pilgrim narratives tell each author's personal stories of blisters, weather, landscapes, food, and people they encountered day by day. When they set out, some may have had only a vague notion of the religious importance of the medieval pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, or the historical basis of many of the rituals in which they participate. As an example, Keith Foskett launched his career as a long-distance hiker and travel adventure writer in 2015 with the publication of The Journey in Between, about his hike from Conques to Compostela. Along the way, he learns the modern French pilgrim song, Ultreia. He is amazed 5 years later to learn that Ultreia is a Latin term that means onward and was used by medieval pilgrims to greet and encourage others. Just this week, an article by Fernando Cerrulla, a forensic anthropologist, announced that the bones identified as those of Santiago the Lesser show signs of beheading, the actual fate of St. James the Elder, putting in question the attribution of the St. James relics in his tomb. Will this put a dent in the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela? Will this deter persons from walking the caminos? I doubt it. Faith in the place and in the person are no longer what is important to most pilgrims. Even the religiously motivated find their inspiration from walking, not the destination. While on the route, are they pilgrims? Absolutely. Will they continue to walk the Camino? Definitely. Are they on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela? Possibly. Does it matter? Not at all. Buen camino and Ultreia.